Thank you all, especially Mark and Wendy. It's wonderful to be here. When I thought about what to do for this conference, I decided to speak on the work and on the theme in Wendy's work that I understand the least. But nihilism. I really don't get it. Not even the word. Like, I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it nihilism or nihilism? No idea. I don't get that concept either. Nihilism, what's it supposed to be? Does it even exist? Does it matter? Hasn't anyone always lamented the loss of values? Aren't we, unlike Nietzsche and Russian aristocrats, materialists? If we don't believe that values explain the course of history, why would their loss be such an important phenomenon? And with so much actual precious life around us dying, the death of God never bothered me much in comparison, so why would the death of values? I consulted with my colleague and friend, Eva von Redecker, knowing her to be very versed in Slavic literature, and here's what she grandiosely said to me. It's over. Nihilism is 19th century. 20th century is cynicism. What the 21st century will be, we do not know yet, but you should go and read some Russians anyway. So I went and I read Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, published in 1862, a generation before Dostoevsky and Chernyshevsky, and widely considered not only the inaugural portrayal of nihilism, but also Nietzsche's crucial inspiration for the topic. The most stunning aspect of that book was just how contemporary it felt. On the first page, Turgenev introduces a young servant. I quote, "The turquoise earring, the greased, multicolored dyed hair, and his regardful posture reveal the person of the youngest, most refined generation." However, the novel's focus will not be on him, more the snowflake kind, but on two young men from the lower landed aristocracy, Bazarov and Arkadji. Their friends from uni who, upon coming home, break the hearts of their old-school, soulful fathers. Arkadji is just a follower, a submissive, privileged kid who turns out all right in the end. His role model friend, the boorish, cold, and arrogant Bazarov, might as well be a tech bro. He's absurdly egocentric, socially inept, and knows everything. To the great horror of the older romanticist generation, he hates art, poetry, and nature. His nihilism is explained as a disregard for all authority. But as his more gentle-minded friend eventually starts observing, he holds, Bazarov that is, his own authority, and a probably misogynistic patriarchal one, as absolutely sacred. Bazarov is an incel of sorts, and his main suggestion for improvement is destruction. I quote, "We act according to what we consider useful. In today's world, negation is particularly useful. So we negate." And then upon the elder's question whether one didn't also need to rebuild, Bazarov goes on, "That's not our business anymore. First, one has to clear." The disruptive science of his day is not data science, but chemistry, which he pursues both for medical and agronomic interests, perhaps also for deeper, more sadistic impulses. He travels with a portable laboratory and obsessively cuts up and analyzes frogs, an echo of Descartes' habit of dissecting a rabbit every day, a live rabbit, as Descartes thought that animals devoid of risk cogitans could feel pain. Bazarov, however, cuts up dead things, and in the end, that kills him as he trains his skill on the corpse of the farmer who died on typhoid, so he infects himself. This being a 19th century Russian novel, the book suggests simultaneously that he also dies of love sickness, as he was rejected by very sensible and free-spirited young heirs. So unlike in our world, the nihilist is not invited to lead an agency to restructure all government, but it's broken down by what he cut off and disregarded. Reading Turgenev, far from relegating nihilism to the 19th century, thus only confirmed Wendy's stance that nihilism is a very crucial and current phenomenon. And it is, of course, even more convincingly contemporary if we follow her own account of it. Contrary to Nietzsche, the loss of God is not so central, nor it is in a way the loss of what value. What nihilism does is to unmoor values from their traditional or transcendental grounding and then transform them beyond recognition. It alters the world more than destroys the heavens. This process has an objective and a subjective side to it. So, of course, it is in Wendy's telling a materialist analysis. The structural development, which Wendy calls nihilism as condition, are captured by what Weber would describe as disenchantment and rationalization. As Marx analyzed already, the human build-up of enhanced productive and then with Weber administrative power simultaneously increases powerlessness. It's powerlessness of a peculiar sort, the kind of blind and numb powerlessness as the ruling forces become more anonymous, complex, and therefore hard to grasp. Weird compulsion or sachliche Herrschaft for the German speakers. This brings us to the individual side, or nihilism as an attitude. The immediate effects of the loss of well-founded values is the conviction, says Wendy, that life itself is meaningless and without value. There's a lot of exactly that depression and ennui in the Fathers and Son novel. Bazarov, lying on a haystack and refusing to be consoled by his friend in Arkady, goes on like this, I quote, "It is a minuscule spot which I take up, infinitely small compared to all the remaining space in which I am not and where I have no business. And in this atom, in this mathematical point, the blood circulates, the brain works, demands things. What nonsense." In Proto-Sartre, in this gas, Bazarov speaks of the stench of his nothingness, to which he, unlike the naive fathers, is condemned to sense. Other than that, he claims to feel nothing but boredom and anger. And that anger is when nihilism becomes darker and closer to the exact configuration Wendy traces in her work. For Bazarov, for instance, that anger takes the form of affirming to have a rod round when in female company. So, as Nietzsche later would, it's exactly the same thing. Wendy's account of nihilism demonstrates how the objective condition, reiterated and concentrated by neoliberalism, favors the tipping of the subjective attitude from desperate boredom into targeted outward-facing aggression. Weirdly, that pivot is done in the name of morality itself. But after market rationality declared everything relative, what remains of morality are broken down shards pre-cut for weaponization. Fungible and trivial, superficial and easily instrumentalized, Wendy again. This is privatized morality designed to turn down and replace the social and democracy. The content of the destructively wielded values stems from instrumentalized traditional morality. The energy to promote them consists in resentment. Resentment drawn both from real losses to atomization and austerity, and from wounded white or male privilege. But that resentment is let loose in such an unrestrained way, that it can just run wild. Be given, as Hans Luger puts it, free rein and free rein. Is again down to neoliberal assault. Neoliberalism undoes conscience too. Referring to Marcuse's notion of regressive desublimation, Wendy sketches how market values wear down that what should stand in the way of aggression, self-restraint, and inhibition, or indeed the conscience. The new entrepreneurial Homo economicus, the subject of competition and human capital enhancement, is constantly enticed to seek gratification, encouraged to use everyone and everything in strategic fashion. He or she or they are operating in a world where nothing is holy and the sky no longer a limit. How should they not give up on the cumbersome constraints of conscience? And the result is described by Wendy as free, stupid, and manipulable, absorbed by, if not addicted to trivial stimuli and gratifications. The subject of repressive desublimation in advanced capitalist society is not just libidinally unbound, released to enjoy more pleasure, but released from more general expectations of social comprehension. It's certainly obvious that part of that description is correct. It captures the world we live in. It captures aspects and effects of nihilism that actually go beyond the 19th century version of it. this constant self-optimization, the gambling not as affliction and tragic fate, that would be 19th century again, Dostoevsky this time, but, as like the standard strategy to get through life. Or also Bazarov was at least still attempting to be useful to society in his destructiveness. And despite himself, he proved the limits of his nihilism by actually managing to get his heart broken, and by an impressively mature and competent word. But nihilism would evolve, and with Wendy's account, we can show that 20th and 21st century cynicism is no successor to nihilism, but a subform and expression of it. Me try. So, I got convinced it's not over. But today, there is a hint of late Freudian, rather bourgeois, or at least old liberal repressiveness in the role that conscience plays in that account. I don't doubt that neoliberalism is key to understand the current conjuncture, but is it so crucial that it destroyed conscience? What conscience anyway? In one place, Wendy refers to the end of 3 centuries of experimentation with democracy. I don't want to diminish those experiments, but if you look at it from a German perspective, Prussian soldiers gunning down the Paris Commune, or imperial administrator in today's Namibia committing genocide, and then it goes on and gets only worse, very little experimentation with democratic conscience. Also, I don't think that from our standpoint as critical theorists, we want to rely so much on inhibition to uphold civilization. None of the Frankfurt School adaptations of Freud's civilization and its discontents took over his conception of eternally necessary repression to safeguard culture. I don't fully mean that. Of course, I do think that maturity and competence, being the right type to break Bazarov's heart, requires some version of self-control, self-transcendence, or definitely sublimation. But to conceive of the immediate impulses as always already antisocial would be pessimist and patriarchal theorized. It depends on the historical formation. That's why for Marcuse, desublimation can also be a revolutionary device. But it has to be desublimation of the drives arising and playful leisure, not those forged under mainstream societal conditions. Marcuse thought that next to all repression in the mid-20th century was surplus repression, i.e. repression which was not necessary to reproduce life. He turns Freud's already crude, stadial model of human history into a pretty vulgar historical materialism, according to which, for most of human history, domination, both inner enhanced and outer activity, was necessary. But now, due to technological progress, he claims those days are over. In fact, his diagnosis is even more drastic. The labor people are pressed to fit into doesn't serve the end of reproducing life, as it would back in the day, according to him, but contributes to one great killing apparatus. That's a pretty familiar thought these days. The drives implicated in bridled and normal functioning are thereby tainted by destructive ends. And what comes out when inhibition falls is not eros, but Canada's unbound. Wendy's obviously right not to take over Marcuse's philosophy of history, but without it, we are back to less historicized Freudianism, with a stipulated death drive always already justifying punitive institutions alongside the fragile superego. Turgenev has 2 slightly farcical side characters, man and woman, who also fashion themselves as nihilists, but are more shallow, silly, and frivolous than Bazarov. They seem very clearly disinhibited, they're all the time drunk and on the sofa, but they're also pretty harmless. So anyway, I think the point is clear, and I've probably already made it far too big, but I want to use it, that's why I need it, as an opening to suggest an auxiliary, additional source to theorize nihilism, an explanation of why values don't just stop checking destructive behavior, but are themselves promoting it. In the 21st century, and along the way towards it already, we seem to have a version not of despair, not of cynicism, but of active affirmation of annihilation. Bazarov on ketamine and sperm to run the world. So again, surprise, I think it has to do with property. I've been convinced for a while now that in order to understand our patriarchal white supremacist, capitalist, and occasionally also beautiful history of modernity, we need to intertwine an analysis of marketization with the genealogy of property. All the permutations of individual and collective sovereignty, colonial conquests, intersecting forms of domination, definitely the ongoing death of nature cannot be understood if we try to simply reduce them. I mean, that's not, obviously it's not saying Wendy's doing that, but Nancy would. If we try to simply reduce even our beloved survey of Federici, if we try to simply reduce them to their function in the self-valorization of value that is capital. That function often exists, but it rarely explains fully how those phenomena came about, hence the turn to genealogy. Anyway, back to nihilism. My suggestion would be to account for nihilism as a propertization of values in two steps. The first transforms the form of values. They become more like personal property. I don't think it's a coincidence that should have happened specifically in the 19th century. That was the time when property law changed from more object-bound to primarily intersubjective interpretation, when material goods, first and foremost the oil that started to be pumped at larger scale in North America, were not coded into property law as objects, but as protected exploitation interests of the owner. And then that in turn allowed first the propertization of brands, and then towards the end of the 19th century, the emergence of patent law. Or also, I mean, since I started in Russia, there you also have the big clash between the modern Code Napoleon that has been sort of defeated by the generation of the fathers in Turgenev's novel. I think they would have maybe just avoided the draft, hence, and they have all this Slavophile romanticism. And the son generation, mid-century, again, is actually very Western influence and likes that kind of more clear-cut, non-traditional property regime, which, I mean, Code Napoleon was the first place that the right to abuse was actually written into law. That didn't exist, not even in Roman law, against more traditional conceptions. So you also have a kind of clash of property regimes there, and it maybe accounts for some of the general shift in discourse. So I'm totally aware that as an explanation, this is absurdly superficial. As a sketch, it's more like to give you a model of how I would go on explaining things if I were more patient and more time, better historian and all these things. But I do think that a certain codification of property, so that property has become something that can enfold personal interests and also immaterial goods, which happens at a certain point in the legal development, in the first place makes it a fit for that stuff of personally held beliefs. And then that's additionally facilitated by the newly declared human rights framework, which, as Christoph Menke puts it, naturalized the content of the will. By that he means that subjective rights transform the content of the will into something raw and given, something no longer discerned in its quality, but in its status as held by a subject, as indeed you hold property. The propertization of values as personal equipment of possessive individuals does more than just making them my values. As property, I can treat them according to property norms, often described as bundle of rights. I can do stuff with property that I can't do with, say, God's imperative voice in my conscience, or a society's sacred principles, or even tradition. I can destroy it. That's the use apputendi, the right to abuse. Or I can exchange it. So that use alienandi, without which there will be no commodity exchange. And I mean, those norms, they're not a disaster wherever they're applied, right? I mean, nothing wrong with this glass being propertized and destructible. Nothing wrong with the guy in the opening scene. You know, he can, with his pink hair, he can do whatever the hell he wants with that. Like, but with values, if you propertize them, there indeed stuff happens. So when Bazarov discusses with the older men he so despises, he often very abruptly switches between showing off his allegedly greater logic and rationality, only to affirm 2 sentences on that it doesn't matter if he contradicts himself. You know, whatever he says, it's his choice what his values are and which ones he discounts. Suddenly the logic ends, because the privatization trumps it. That, of course, pretty much finishes off the values as values, if you can do that necessarily. That in that, I'm just restating a point that Wendy made also about instrumentalization, shifts the focus. We've now hit the devaluation of value, and I need to have a little detour by Nietzsche. It seems to me that Nietzsche, when facing the situation of newly disposable values, perhaps reading Turgenev and excitement and horror, took a very particular turn. He celebrated the possible overcoming of that great sickness of the individual, the dead conscience. But also saw clearly that there would be no individual, let alone a superhuman, without values. And that would need to be values of a new sort. I would interpret the whole project of Zarathustra as the deluded but also grand attempt to become an absolute individual, and though endowed with fully self-authorized values. The turn Nietzsche takes from privatization runs via romanticist ideals of authorship and a certain, you could say, Lockeanism. They have to be my values in a much deeper sense. I need to have made them. And I can only be sure of that if they resemble no one else's values. I don't know. So Nietzsche, as it were, uses another shtick in the battle of property rights, the exclusivity, in order to affirm the premium self-ownership characteristic of the superhuman. My brother, if you have a virtue and it is your virtue, then you share it with no one. That's Zarathustra. Or in Beyond Good and Evil, good is not good anymore once your neighbor utters it. And I mean, the German formulation is even better there. It's like, once your neighbor puts it in his mouth. This attempt to render absolute the owner-like control over values is, of course, pretty tragic and ultimately self-defeating, as it has to deny the socially shared matrix of our symbolic resources. The impossibility of this exercise of sort of completely self-generated and authorized values comes out almost as self-caricature in Nietzsche's desperate fantasy of self-birth, also from Zarathustra. Sorry, and it just have to read this quote. For the creator to be the child that shall be born anew, he also has to be the one giving birth, and in her very pain. So that kind of shows you the kind of complete, like, exaggerated fantasy that you need in order to uphold the illusion that there could be something as exclusive, self-created value, like self-burst. So while this particular twist to master the privatization of value might be misguided, perhaps even remains tied to nihilism and its compulsory rejection of anything shared and social, it is anything but cynical. And I mean, certain low moments of Nietzsche aside, it's also not affirmative of annihilation either. So that's a different turn. It's not the turn that the sort of general course of modernity took. That happens down another route. And that route takes the second step of privatization, this time not of values form, that's done, but of content. Precisely because values, once they can be declared nil or applied instrumentally, lose all intrinsic substance, their form can start to inflect their content more and more. Freedom, then, is not just my personal possession, but also my personal possessiveness. The right to destroy and abuse itself becomes a value. It can reside in the superego just as well as in the id, better perhaps. We could go through that with other values as well. Like, I mean, actually, Paul Gilroy has this very beautiful thing on solidarity turning into what he calls logo solidarity, just sort of almost a fascistic way of belonging to that. It's in between camps where he says, actually, you start defining your relations just by outwardly held visual signs that are the same. I just feel like that's exactly this branding logic informing the content of solidarity. And for truth as well, it can be my exclusively held belief, and anyone who challenges it is a trespasser, that it completely changed what truth is in the context. That I would argue that it's always this kind of drive to abuse, alienation, and exclusivity that starts to turn into the core of the value. And in a way, it's an active drive then, once it resides also in the id, also in the superego. It's an active drive to create terra nullius. It takes over the whole apparatus. Enter nihilism as annihilationism. Propertization in value content doubles down as always already outward-facing destroy. In Turgenev, the torture of animals, sorry, it's going to be a bit cruel. Trigger warning, animal lovers. In Turgenev, the torture of animals allegedly served the scientific purpose. Soon after, in Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky portrays it as pure excess of propertization. The scene is one where a coachman, Nikolka, frustrated with his lame horse, beats it to death. There's no mercy, also no ketamine. It was a veterinary drug at the beginning to anesthetize. My property, shouted Nikolka, with bloodshot eyes, brandishing the bar in his hands. He stood as though regretting that he had nothing more to be. I think we have to understand that this too not as some raw and original violence. Turgenev's fathers had diagnosed in Bazarov a Mongolian brutishness. That's what they call it. But there's nothing primitive about it, nothing originary about it. It's a brand new form of behavior, a resulting completion of nihilism as provocation. Because there's aggression all through human history, but that's the form that aggression has in that context. Nevertheless, for Mikolka's horse slaughter, one might still argue that property is the excuse. He says it's fine, but challenge him, it's my property, I can do what I want, I beat the horse to death. It might be the excuse, not the driver for the aggression. Therefore, I have one last cruelty to animals quote, which shows how the capacity to torture turns into a necessary discipline. So not an outburst. The conscience doesn't stop it, it demands it. And that's a passage from a novel by Yukio Mishima. It's mid-20th century Japanese author and failed neo-fascist putschist. And in the passage, the main character describes how he and a group of adolescent boys killed several stray animals on the street. And then he registers, the narrator, his relief to only have very fleetingly felt an impulse of pity, which then swiftly dissolves. And now I quote, he then goes on to say, the leader always claimed that such actions were necessary to fill the emptiness of the world. Only killing can fill this emptiness. Like cracks in a mirror. Only like that, they would gain true power over existence, says the leader. Power over existence. This is not any power or empowerment. It's a specific power, specifically nihilistic power of the ultimate owner. Yeah. And that, I think, is really the culmination, the way in which propertization doesn't just cut out specific groups. I mean, it's always specific who gets targeted and creatures as disposable, as legitimate objects of abuse. But once it really provides the core values for the subject to understand himself, his freedom, his agency, as that of the absolute owner, the whole world is negated even prior to destruction. It turns into mere space where I am not, as Bazarov has put it, or emptiness for Mishima's leader. For full-blown nihilism, the world isn't so much meaningless, but empty. No world at all. Nothing but abstract material, as Adorno Horkheimer write in one place in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I mean, that's a rare place, because their main story is about instrumentalizations, but there's this place where they say, abstract material which has no other property than to be the substrate of that possession. As proto-property, life isn't just devoid of value, it's devoid of light. And Of course, we would get there with Wendy's account work. I mean, that's the strength of it, that it fully faces also this festive and vengeful kind of overdrive character of right-wing affect, right? But I think the propertization of the will better captures this tipping over into overdrive, the incredibly fast-turning hinge between value and violence. It goes so quick, And so I think, theoretically, it would make sense to intertwine the explanatory power of neoliberalism and marketization with that of propertization. Property, specifically modern and usable and alienable property, is the presupposition of marketization. You don't have a commodity if it's not privatized before. No commodity that are property, and few things are born as property. They require all sorts of infrastructures, legal codes, and violence to be turned into it. And then when marketization picks up the pieces and circulates them at all costs, many losses ensue. The market, Polanyi would say, marketization leads to the tearing of the social fabric. The market is no safe place for owners, and it is held for non-owners. In the market's world of mobility and instrumentalization, the thirst for stability and security rises, a thirst for which there, of course, would be an emancipatory answer, but for which, unfortunately, the retrogressive one is always already at hand. Compensatory property, what I call phantom possession, is some form of ideological entitlement and supremacy, something hard and solid, while everything else melts into hot air. The rancor and the rage and the revenge for the wound is all there in Wendy's telling, and it only takes the form it does, I would say, because the lost or wounded object in the first place had a specific shape, that of property entitlement, and hence the reaction unleashed is not any disinhibition, but the legitimate resort of the wronged owner. Armed response, trespassers will be shot. But privatization perhaps also makes it a bit easier to account for some of the nihilistic stances we are currently facing, which seem to outdo all instrumentalization, outdo Homo economicus even in its most frenzied entrepreneurial form. I'm, of course, thinking of chainsaws, or more precisely, of wood chippers. That's apparently Elon Musk's mascot machine. Quote, I could have gone to some pretty great parties at the weekend, but decided to feed Uber's aid to the wood chipper instead, he tweeted. In my experience with forestry, chainsaws are what loses people some fingers. Wood chippers, you lose you an arm if you're lucky. The whole Doge endeavor, definitely the attempt to cut the U.S. Agency for International Development from 10,000 to 15 employees, is in one way the staggering truth, if any was needed, that Wendy is right to call neoliberalism a form of governmentality. And actually think it should be applause now or something. It's so obvious. Yeah, and I'm on the first. At the same time, this is something else than rationalization. This is the active desire to see nothingness unfold, to have the cleanest slate, to demonstrate total control, again, of course, modeled on dominion. Efficiency doesn't mean anything anymore. It's not related to any future performance. It's just a convenient excuse for cuts as end in themselves. Cuts to fill the emptiness of the world. And when he writes at some point, if white men cannot own democracy, there will be no democracy. If white men cannot own the planet, there shall be no planet. But I think it's important to stress that destroying it is how white men have owned the world for the last 400 years. And now it's kind of just more openly affirmed. And if that's the case, if apocalypse actually enhances your ownership credentials, it's less surprising that it plays such a positive role and such a key role in some of the oligarchs' worldviews. So last summer already, there was an invitation to an exclusive sort of party and unconference dedicated to tech elites called the Apocalypse Ball, that was phrased as follows. Consider our rotting cities. Consider our corrupted language and what's become of science. Consider the world as it stands today, not as you'd like it to stand, but as it already presents. How much of this world should be preserved? Maybe if you're not trying to destroy the world, you aren't trying hard enough. maybe that's the sort of party Elon Musk skipped in order to implement some of the allegedly necessary destruction. I skipped Peter Thiel, it gets too long, but he has this whole eschatological worldview that affirms apocalypse. I go quickly to one of his inspirers, because that's where we more precisely get back to the property. Curtis Jarman, the tech entrepreneur, developed in rather clumsy blog posts a theory of dark enlightenment and neo-monarchy. Recently, he's been kind of showcased as a kind of oracle or mastermind, because that guy already said in 2007 that the government should be taken over by a CEO. And I think that, of course, gives him way too much influence. I mean, yes, read Wendy said that's neoliberalism, and that he's a symptom of it. It wasn't somehow his masterminded plan. But I think some other aspect of that 2007 manifesto, it's actually entitled the Formalist Manifesto, are quite interesting. Here's how it goes, very quickly. German battles with two problems in this text. How to get rid of the violence arising from uncertainty over who owns what. You know, big problem. And how to overcome the purposelessness of public life. I quote him, "I have no idea what the purpose of the US is. I've heard that there's someone who supposedly runs it, but he doesn't appear to even be able to fire his own employees." So the US in its current state is unclaimed goods, terra nullius again, and will only be infused with purpose once claimed by an owner. How do you choose an owner? You don't. You don't even consent, however implicit in some social contract or something. Jarman's solution to the question of allocation after the privatization of everything is that whoever is most powerful should hold the thing. Whether we're talking about the US, Baltimore, or your wallet, as formalist, that's his position, the formalist is only happy when ownership and control are one and the same. So ownership collapses back into possession. The perversion of liberal equality, that differences in material wealth translates into differences in power, is here affirmed in inversion. Difference in power should translate into difference in cultivation. Only then there will be peace and purpose. This really is a regressive desublimation of the social contract, a farcical version of Hobbes' nightmare, the state of nature, but sold as a cure to the hollowness of existence as an idle object. And in a way, this does seem to capture some of the current logic of nihilism. I mean, if you look at Trump's so-called peace diplomacy, it does seem to follow the rule of, like, give to the usurper or their arms supplier, give to the annihilators. That proposal is worse than rape culture. It reactivates the idea that your rapist is whom you should be obliged to marry. Okay. I actually suspect that requiring superlatives and horror scenarios to criticize a political constellation is itself a creeping form of nihilism, perhaps already testimony to the privatization of meaning and not just values. So I'll stop here with the patchy illustrations and try, on one last page, to expand the philosophical argument a bit, because only that will also give us a glimpse at possibilities of this. Nihilism comes down to a particular alienation from the world, and so far argued that it is a possessive alienation from the world. However, neither alienation nor the world are quite right here too. Why not alienation? Because we don't have here a contradiction between two sides which share an origin and shall be reunited on a higher sublated level. I think it makes more sense to speak of diremption and Zweihung in Hegel's German. I take that somewhat, there's actually diremption where I found it is in Gillian Rose, which is a bit ironic because she would accuse all of us postmodernists of nihilism, but whatever. Diremption is the breaking apart of a union that is not original, at least not from all perspectives. One of her examples is divorce. To the child might seem like the breaking apart is something that was always joined, but in fact the two people involved had separate lives before and will have afterwards, at least if both parties survive. That's the same with a particular union between owning subject and object owned. Once the template for marriage, as owner, the subject ceases to exist once it loses its object. Which is why some possessive subjects reaffirm their credentials by destroying the object. the relation of possessive individuals to the world is a constant diremption. In a way, it is a perpetually violent divorce, or no, a perpetual violent divorce. Wendy, both in her preface to Marx's Capital very recently and in her 1988 Manhood and Politics, calls this decapitation, the severing of head from body. And actually, I'm like, he's standing here, instrumentalization, there should be privatization in there as well, and you can do things with it. It's all there already in 1988. The figure that, so here's Wendy speaking to us from the 80s, quote, "Once man alienates his head from his body, once he conceives of the body as something to be mastered, once he institutionalizes that conception in the organization of social life, he is set up upon a course in which he strives to conquer, master, dominate, or control all that threatens his precarious freedom from the body." So everything that I assemble under that umbrella of privatization can also, comes up in even that tiny passage, and you should read the whole book. So is there a way out of it alight? Not reunion or sublation, because the body definitely doesn't want that head back. Or at least not as long as the head doesn't realize that it too is body. And that's the liberation what consists in the abolition of the ownership part. So it's not sublation, it's abolition. Then there will be space. I quote again, "The body is not headless without its official head. The body is not matter. The matter is not formless. The matter is not inert, but substance and sustenance, the source of all power." So the body will be arrived with the abolished tenant. Which I think, that your laughter free, what's the word? And anyway, anticipates, if the word, my next argument, which is that there's some kind of problem with that imagery, because, once the head is lost, it's really on. You can't do the rest, whatever you do. So the image of the split off body, I think, also works particularly well for the gender relation. But other forms of dominion cut elsewhere. So when it comes to the world, the nihilist is alienated or dirempted from, I would suggest that on the most general level, we simply speak of life. Life that always in some way exceeds the deadening property form imposed on it by colonial modernity. And life that has to be dealt with in a kind of more material, active way in order to facilitate liberation. The fight against nihilism is one to depropertize life and to tend to the cuts inflicted by the self-proclaimed owners, when you will call it repair in her closing lecture. And I think it matters that we really understand this process as transformative material labor and Islam, which plays a beautiful role in the closing chapter of My Modern Politics. We need to change the condition things are in, and then the attitude will follow. To just capture it and to one half sentence, I close with yet another quote from Wendy: "Why don't we let our objects fly?" Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Eva. So Eva and I are trying to think together, but we think really, really differently. And but we yearn for something in common. And I have never been so struck by that difference and that yearning as I was listening to my words in Eva's mouth at the beginning of this talk, which were so foreign. I mean, the politicalness and the sociality of my words in this philosopher's mouth who loves creatures and creatureliness And I was thinking about how part of our gap is that I am always oriented to political formations, and Eva is always oriented to the creatures. And I want to say philosophy or philosophic formations, but that doesn't capture it. But I'm going to start there because what I'm going to push on, you clinging to my little nihilism analysis and pushing away your little propertization one, is politics. And it's not that I don't agree with 99% of what you've said. And which is also true of Mark. So at the beginning, you posed this great question. If we don't believe values guide history, if we're all materialists after all, what the hell difference does it make if values disappear? That was always the bullshit of liberalism. You didn't say that, but that was the implied thing. And I thought about that question as you were speaking, and I thought, well, this book for me was all about trying to imagine how a left, an ecological left, a feminist ecological left, an anti-racist ecological left could re-enter politics, could gain ground again, could stand again, could have some power in a discourse by which we are currently feeling, I think, quite squeezed and quite overwhelmed. And what I do take really seriously from Weber, even though he puts it rather crudely, is that the political domain is the domain of what he calls value clash, value contestation. Sometimes he just calls it warring gods. And that is different than the material conditions that produce that value clash, than the material conditions that have produced the particular historical moment at which we find ourselves. But the future, the possibility of a future, to the extent that it's determined politically, to the extent that we're combatants politically, is a combat over values. And of course, that's what's missing from Marx for me. And that's also what's missing from Foucault for me. And that's what's missing from most of our radical lights, like intellectual lights. And so that's why values matter. And that's why, to get to talk, the idea of a full-blown nihilism that, as you put it, is not simply meaningless but empty, devoid of life, and then attacking life, a nihilistic toward life, I think that's right. And that what you insist is the propertization of the will better explains this annihilation. That is, that propertization of the will has been taken to such a pitch that it better explains this annihilation than maybe my genealogy of nihilism. Leaves to one side, your account still for me leaves to one side how we approach the problem politically of that propertization. I'm going to allow your analysis to be in here. When what we face in the political realm now is this desecration, demolition, inversion of values, where freedom means fascism, fascism is what the left is accused of, where values are just these wildly instrumentalized, inverted, commodified seems a very old-fashioned way of putting it, but certainly commercialized things, and everybody knows it. So if propertization of the will is an account of the nihilistic force of that politics, I'm still not sure that it helps us understand the nihilistic, let's call it phenomenology or symptomology or display in political life of the of the extent to which we are not just dealing with death drives or annihilation, but also with an absurdity beyond an irony about the way that we conduct political discourse itself, about the way that we argue, about the way that we render evidence, about what counts as truth, about what counts as facticity. And so I think I'm going to invite you and me to put ourselves together, where you get to have the annihilation analysis. I think yours is better than mine. I do. But I don't think it does all the work that I was trying to do with nihilism. Last thing I want to say, and then I think we should give patient audience members a chance. It has to do with disinhibition and loss of conscience. So it's true that I left 2/3 of Marcuse out while grabbing one piece of him for the analysis. And the piece of Marcuse that I grabbed for the analysis was the piece that allowed me to track what nihilism, what Nietzsche says nihilism depends on, which is that loss of conscience, and what Marcuse argues disinhibition looks like when you have that full loss of conscience in a culture or society. Not Nietzsche's strong suits. He doesn't talk about societies. So you are right, of course, that for Marcuse, desublimation has a lot of revolutionary potential. That conscience sounds like a really conservative force. I guess I'm going to make a similar move to the one I made with Mark. I'm not sure just because conscience has been bound up with the kinds of things that Nietzsche diagnoses beautifully, the self-flagellation, the hair shirt, the naysaying to the soul, to life itself. I'm not sure that it's opposite disinhibition, or what Marcuse calls desublimation, is where we can go in the Anthropocene. And in particular, I fear that a left or right-wing celebration of disinhibition, and I think we have more on the right these days than we have on the left, but the left had its turn in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when I was writing Manhood and Politics. And I'm not sure that politics and political responsibility and political freedom and responsiveness to all the delicate and damaged planet that we live on and now must care for differently. I'm not sure that either desublimation or disinhibition will be our friends, even as we want to dance, we want to sing, we want Dionysus, we want all of those things, and they have their place. But the question is, can we find ways to give place to that while, I guess I'm going to use the recourse to conscience, while we become more conscientious and more broadly and more widely conscientious than we ever have been. And I guess another way of putting it is, will we finally grow up? Will human beings finally become mature? And I do think that requires some inhibition. Delicately, no, let's not say delicately, deliberately organized, deliberated about, but nonetheless absolutely part of our everyday existence. We cannot have it all. We cannot have abundance. As Recline and Proud, Go Where You Will. We cannot have, but we can have joy. We can have delight. But I think, we're the creatures who have experimented both with wild, disorderly grabbing in the propertization form, but also even in other forms, and experimented with ways of being, well, let's say what I am seeking is for us to experiment with ways of being responsible, ways of being collaborative, that actually require a lot of restraint. and non-sublimation. Okay, I'll sit with you now because I think we're all going to be to them. Thank you.
On the second half, it is so funny because I think in every
Speak a little.
in the second half, like I start with the point on desublimation. I just agree with you. The weird thing is, I agree as a political creature. Every discussion, I'll be the Prussian that says, no, it's not about what your limits are. It's about that needs to happen now, otherwise the house. But then somehow theoretically, I cling to this. Like, I do think we will really be duped in the future if we don't believe that there's some way that the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom can kind of blend in something like unalienated labor. And that I think we anyway agree. So that's so otherwise you're right, and I kind of really one-sidedly pushed it too far there. Just also really briefly. Yes, I mean, I'm so glad Mark was talking about democracy because I was like, no politics in my paper. And it was wow. And also no intersectionality and stuff like this kind of animal torture. I realize it's absurd. But I do think with this conceptual apparatus, maybe despite my sensations, you can do more of that work. And I think the way I would see it connected to politics is that actually, this is a kind of out-of-me nervous thing coming after a whole bunch of movements has mobilized under the banner of life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people were like, oh, you, Black Lives Matter, you, neo-nominators, we desire ourselves alive, you, water is life, standing rock people, you are all doing some kind of identity politics, blah, blah, that's not the problem. We need to fight capitalism. And I think this analysis of privatization allows you to say, no, there's more going on. From many different corners, those movements in the name of life fight against what I would call privatization or against some sort of violence that is actually sort of the undoing of which would go pretty far in undoing capitalism as we know it. And so that's there. So in a way, that's how I think it could then afterwards be used to clear away some of the absurd critiques of those movements. And I think that's all that I can do as a philosopher. Just manage it all.
Amazing. Perfect. Okay, the floor is open for questions. We'll collect 3 at a time and maybe do 2 rounds. So, and I'll start with Catherine in the very back, and then move my way to in the orange. I don't know your name. I'm sorry. And then in the blue there. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stand up. I should get the last because I am afraid.
Sorry.
But I have a question for Eva Devenney, and she's a believer maybe about this or nothing. So I think it's without, especially your critique, there is this very strong, like anti-temporal attention about it. Sad for us, like in this logical verticalization. But I was wondering if you wanted to explain a little more your feminist perspective on this invention rate, I feel like that's such a, that logic is so strong in there. And I was to just ask you if you want to say a little bit more about that sort of feminist perspective in your thesis, and also maybe what that's, if you wanted to speculate a little bit, also what that means for feminists in maybe preaching when these comments like what to do, right? Like, and how to respond to like, what is going on, and if it's not in living with values, and how it would get on. So that's the unformulated question that was indeed just thinking.
Great. Okay, then. Orange, you can also say your name.
Anyway, I'm questioning for Mark Devenney. Well, I was a bit really for Wendy related to what Wendy said, because Mark, your problem with this fantasy concept was that this idea of anthropos was like an abstract, non-historical concept. But then why not use the capitalism concept? Because capital is indeed this abstract power which is trying to erase the the probably some difference also expanding in the order or beyond because of this process of self-realization. So then also you're concerned with giving an account with colonial intentions can be done, of course, with the concept of capital. So maybe you can elaborate on this, and also what Wendy was mentioning, because with capital we have the same problem of how to think our political responsibility. If we put too much strength on this concept of capital as an automatic subject, it will also have a problem with our own political responsibility. So maybe you can elaborate on this.
Hi, thanks, Tim. Thank you very much for those speakers. Just one, I'll start with a reflection/question from Mark, which hopefully will come back to the discussion of values as well. So yeah, Mark, thanks for a wonderful paper of very specific strands of thought. I was interested in the second half of your paper. You're talking about temporality and that really useful articulation of that, which would have already been here, right? That doing an interesting contemplation to prefigurative ways of thinking about things. And one of the things that struck me that I was thinking through was that's really valuable, not just because it's helpful to think about questions of futurity, maybe as a rejoinder to some of what Wendy was gesturing towards in one of her critiques, but also it's kind of factually true. When we're thinking as people in proximity to political theory, one form or another, in the radical strands, we're always thinking, what's the subject to come, the subject that will be the answer to these things. And we often overlook the fact that this stuff is always already here, right? So in a literal sense, the forms of resistance and refusal to life are kind of already very present, whether that's thinking about other ways of understanding ecology, or human forms of resistance for refusal. So I wanted to kind of get you to draw that out a little bit in your paper, but it also opens up an interesting kind of ethical and methodological question. So like we start out with these ancient peoples who are just this fragment in Herodotus, right? Fragment and this history that's all we're given. Which obviously opens up interesting questions around if some of the answers, if the politics that we desire is actually already being practiced, we just need to learn how to see it, which is obviously a point that Brancio might make in the background to a paper where a lot of scruples left to Caballero or Moulton or whoever. There's a question of how we engage with those materials, often if they are the subject of violence, subject of the wounds of ecologies, which is only going to increase when they disappear. And as a linked question to that, the kind of ethical question of who are we to look at these practices and how do we synthesize them into an articulation of another politics which isn't extractive or tokenistic or appropriative in different ways, right? And then that brings me back to this discussion of value, which I find is really productive, and I'm really glad that Wendy's kind of encouraged us to do it, and that Eva's taking that kind of up. The thinking values are useful here, and when you're thinking about the kind of the potential evacuation of value from a certain postmodern irony that which I get, and I know it's a stereotype, but there's truth to it. But I think one of the values that I keep returning to is ideas around humility that you might get from Sarah Ruffing or Grant Button, and thinking about humility, vulnerability, and what you get in postmodernism, especially in its rearticulation through various contemporary feminist traditions, some like radical traditions, is the need to have a limit to what we can know, right? The limits to how we can know these people probably 2,500 years ago in the fragment that we have, the limit to how we might be able to translate. That there's a certain ethicality to that humility that might be valuable, which is a better articulation than maybe the high postmodernism of the 80s and its evaporation of value in a kind of implicit masculinist move. So, not saying that humility is the answer. I'd like it to be part of that conversation. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we might not have time for another round of questions, but I invite you to answer.
Are you sure?
Excited.
Catherine, I do observe that very well, and I think I would say that it starts perhaps even more from femicide than from rape, but of course, rape is closer to the logic of femicide than whatever sex or something. And I think that is partly due to the fact that I was so impressed with Neo-Namenos, which I actually encountered in Italy, because I lived there for a bit. And the way that movement managed to really organize around some of the core radical feminist concerns while being totally well, not even not like trans-inclusive, but even trans-led and queer and anti-fascist and all that. And that was really like, okay, that's possible. And then, I think you do need to do some theoretical work that, like, even Federici in a way is still too biologistic or something. It's why then this, I felt this framework of the constructivism through privatization helped me to figure out what I thought was going on already in the slogans and in the mobilization. And I think that this logic is not confined to feminism, but at this moment, where the first time in the world history, really of the world, extinction. I mean, Mark worked it out so beautifully. And it's like in a generalized level that has become the grammar of so many social movements. It's not a surprise. And I would say that we had a movement cycle. Now we're in the counter-revolution cycle that, with some exceptions, which was, I would say, a new type of social movement, what I call revolution for life, which is different from the kind of standard socialist perforating the means of production type movement, and also different from civil rights movement, which always mobilizes from this or that side, from ecocide, now genocide, and from femicide, from death to police violence. And I think we need to sort of philosophically understand what the logic of that is, but I'm very interested. Can I say one sentence on Tim and the values? I think it really made me understand something that how I could also answer to Wendy's question of why do values matter. Kind of just understood. I think that part of my problem with values is that as a philosopher, my meta-ethics are not deontological with values, or they are more like Bernard Williams' thick moral concepts. They're Alice Crowley's version of the virtue theory, which is very linguistic, Raymond has that stance as well. So I think it's more in the language overall. And this thing that I now have come to the exact same impasse, that you saw in my paper, and then you say you're also grappling with, that I just really do not know what to do with it. I would not describe as the loss of values, but actually as the loss of me. I think we're doing something to language, and large language models are doing something to language. The fact that now already the internet is flooded with plastic language that is kind of generated by machines, that there's something kind of breaking down so totally, like in that level of privatization. And now it's talking about the 19th century privatization of values. I think now 21st century privatization of meaning. But yeah, that's it. As I said, I'm hitting a wall there, and that's why I'm also so obsessively interested in some of the stuff that Amila yesterday talked about. I also want to ask Mark later one question. We could also add it to the question. I love this stuff that you want to cling to the shoe myth, right? But with the Anthropocene, like in the denominator.
Okay, to respond to that.
That's okay. But yeah, so I want to make you cling more to the shoe myth. Maybe that's the what do you make? Don't you said it some kind, that's what humankind was, and it's not all that it didn't. That's getting through. Why not embrace a version of species today in a completely new and constructivist way, which would allow you to answer to this very Wendy had with arguably responsible. Marx has one toleration of the species being where it's like, we are that animal that can live according not only to the rules of its own species, but all species. That's, of course, ridiculous hyperbole because 80% of the species we haven't even discovered. But there's such truth in it. You can understand what that tree needs, and you can destroy it and put us all around it, or you can water it. We can, and that gives us a certain responsibility. So anyway, I want to know how far you would go with this kind of potentiality utopian or show it.
Okay, so
and it's not only Marx, right? It's all still about property. It's not you don't take off the capital stuff.
So capitalism. Let me, because I'm going to come back to it. So capitalism, the reason why I don't use it, in part because the reason I want to hold on for the moment, just for this paper, thinking of the demos, is because I don't think capitalism captures something about a dominant way of being that extends beyond capital. So capital is implicated. Capital is deeply, deeply responsible for the world we now find ourselves in. But it's the beginning of the explanation, not the end. It's part of a configuration of explanations. And I'm worried that certainly in the way Jason Moore, for example, he uses that term, that what we end back with is a set of debates that actually don't take us that far forward. I think that, and the point here is not simply to reject Marx. The point is not to be a Marxist, as Marx himself said. The point is to read Marx in conversation with a range of others. So I think but there's something else, and this goes to the question of property. I read, and perhaps this would in some way be a response to Wendy's concern about the account of propertization. I read property, as does Eva, in association with propriety and a range of other properties, but also with that ontological question of what is deemed to be proper to the human. So rather than simply focusing on propertization as the thingification of the world, I'm interested in the ways in which, if we think through property, we're also thinking about of what it is to be and what the presuppositions are that go with that notion of what it is to be. And that, I think, is something that we don't necessarily get from Marx, although in the German ideology, which I wrote about in a previous text, I think Marx goes some way towards that, actually. So I want to capture something that goes beyond mere propertization, to think about a configuration of relations that allows us to think the relationship between claims to being and what is proper to being, and how that then relates to particular forms of propertization, relations to other creatures, etc. That's a much more longer argument. And I'll come to the responsibility thing in relation to what Tim said. Tim, thank you. You picked up some. I didn't want to
close very soon.
I didn't want to engage in a critique, but thank you for the comment about prefigurative. It wasn't a critique so much as an attempt to rethink that notion of prefiguration in a manner that I hope is more productive. What was the other? The archive. I can only agree with you about the archive, but of course, archives are always incomplete. And working with Saidiya Hartman, it leaves us with ways of engaging with the archive, where for also forms of respect, but also remaking and reimagining of what futures could be. So I'll leave that there. But the last big question was about values. I'm not sure about this, to be frank. I'm wary of writing books for the future, despite having done that in some sense. And with regard to alienation, the human, perhaps the reason I don't do that is because I read Althusser too closely and fell in love with theories related to humanism and got really worried about the Lukácsian account of alienation and what it presupposed about a species being. But it may be that I need to go back to that. Yeah. It may be that I need to go back to Lukács in a more generous vein and forget the Althusserian. Sorry, I've been as quick as I can. I haven't really answered.
We're at the beginning of a conversation I wish we could have all day. I just want to say, my reading of our world is there's a surfeit betweening, and it's deracinated, it's detached from a lot of realities, it's detached from shared meaning. It has a lot of arbitrariness in it. It's mediated endlessly by capital, obviously. But I don't think meaninglessness or absence of meaning is our problem. So in the end, does real meaning when you really mean it, like that. Yeah, but I think that's about our so-called opposition really, really means it. They mean it. The world belongs to them, and
but that's the only thing they mean, and everything else.
I don't think that's right. Okay, we're done.